Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Research Podcast.
Great to be back.
We've got a really critical deep dive on our hands today. We're plunging right into the heart of this escalating conflict between Israel and Iran.
Yeah, it really feels like something's shifting, doesn't it?
It does. And we want to get beyond just the daily headlines to understand what's really happening, especially after those incredibly intense and frankly widespread Israeli strikes we've seen recently.
That's right. And to do that, we've pulled together insights from some exceptionally sharp analysis. We're leaning pretty heavily on pieces by experts like Stephen Cook over in foreign policy. Daniel Shapiro, who used to be the U.S. ambassador to Israel, he wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs.
Right. Important perspective there.
Absolutely. And also a really fascinating piece also in Foreign Policy where journalist John Haltiwanger interviews the Iranian writer Afshon Ostovar.
Okay, so multiple angles.
Exactly. Different perspectives. But when you put them together, they start to paint a much clearer and maybe a more concerning picture.
Definitely. So our mission for this deep dive really is to unpack the core arguments these sources are making.
Yeah.
To find those surprising nuggets of info that make you think differently.
Yeah.
And really get past the surface level to understand the strategic forces, the true objectives at play here. What's happening behind the scenes? What are the goals that maybe aren't immediately obvious?
And one of the first things that just jumps out, something Stephen Cook really emphasizes in his analysis, is just the sheer scale and the breadth of those recent Israeli strikes against Iran. This wasn't like the kind of targeted, almost surgical thing you might expect, or that maybe we've seen before. It just felt different. Much bigger.
Okay, let's dig into that. That scale, that's exactly the critical observation Cook starts with, isn't it? He asks this fundamental question. Why did Israel carry out such a massive, widespread attack across Iran?
Yeah.
Historically, and based on what Israel said publicly, lobbying efforts, especially towards the U.S., the main focus always seemed to be Iran's nuclear program.
Always the nuclear program.
Yeah. The whole narrative was stopping Iran from getting the bomb. So if that was the goal, why didn't these strikes just hit, nuclear sites? Why this huge scope?
That is absolutely the core of Cook's initial point. And the sources, they really drive home just how broad the targets were. It wasn't just the expected nuclear facilities, which, let's face it, are often buried deep underground, really hard to hit.
All right, fortified.
Exactly. According to these analyses, the strikes hit a much, much wider range of sites. They went after leaders, scientists, major military bases, critical infrastructure like power stations, airports.
Wow.
And this is a really sensitive point, but it's crucial and highlighted in the source material it mentions that children were among the casualties.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this isn't just a laser focus on centrifuges anymore, not at all.
Hitting leadership and civilian infrastructure and military bases all across the country. That's a world away from just trying to dismantle a nuclear program. That feels like a fundamentally different kind of operation.
It does.
So what does this widespread targeting suggest then? If the goal isn't just the nuclear program, what are these strikes actually trying to achieve?
Well, Cook's perspective, as it's presented in that foreign policy article, is that these actions strongly suggest a different and potentially much larger or maybe more ambitious objective than simply stopping the nuclear program.
Okay.
The nature of the behavior just feels distinct, and he characterizes it quite strongly, actually. He suggests it appears extremist and maybe unjustified when you look at that wide scope, the scale of the destruction,
right,
and the targeting of infrastructure and, tragically, civilians, as the source notes. It just goes beyond what you'd think is strictly necessary to neutralize a nuclear threat alone.
So for you listening, this is a really critical reframing. If these sources are right, and the main goal isn't just shutting down the nuclear program anymore, then pretty much everything we thought we knew about this conflict might need adjusting.
It's a big shift in thinking.
Yeah. What is Israel really trying to achieve here with this level of force, this breadth?
Yeah.
And what does this apparent shift in targeting strategy tell us about the evolving and maybe increasingly dangerous nature of this whole confrontation? It feels like the stakes have suddenly gone way, way higher.
And this really leads us straight into where Daniel Shapiro's analysis picks up, the former U.S. ambassador. He offers this key insight into what's driving the current heightened phase of the conflict. He argues that the fuel for this war, the core element that seems to be really intensifying it, isn't just about facilities or capabilities, it's centered directly on the heads of Iranian leaders.
The heads of Iranian leaders. That's a pretty vivid phrase.
It is. It suggests that's where the most intense pressure and action are being focused right now.
So why? Why such an aggressive focus on targeting individuals right at the very top of Iran's military, maybe political structure?
Yeah.
And there's that really fascinating, almost counterintuitive point in the source about this. Iran is actually announcing the names and roles of its casualties publicly.
Yeah, that's unusual.
Very unusual. You don't normally see nations advertising their losses like that in real time during a conflict. Why would they do that? What's the thinking there?
Well, what's truly fascinating here, as the sources explain it, is Iran's likely strategic motive for doing that, for publicly announcing casualties. It's not just, transparency. It seems to serve several strategic purposes.
Okay.
First, it gives them a clear public justification for their own retaliatory strikes against Israel, like that big drone and missile barrage we saw.
Ah, right. Look what they did to us first.
Exactly. By announcing who was killed, especially these high-ranking officers, they frame their actions to the world not as aggression, but as a necessary response to direct attacks they've suffered. They get to play the victim, the one being attacked, which directly counters Israel's narrative that its own strikes are preemptive or defensive.
Okay, that makes sense. It's a way to control the international narrative, maybe try to get some sympathy, put pressure on other countries, maybe the U.S., to rein Israel in by highlighting these losses.
Exactly. It's pure narrative warfare. But announcing the names also has this powerful strategic effect, both inside Iran and externally towards Israel.
How so?
Well, internally, losing high-ranking officials and then admitting it publicly, that puts immense pressure on the Iranian regime's credibility. It makes them look vulnerable, in the face of Israeli capabilities.
Right. Not a good look domestically.
Not at all. And crucially, according to the source, it forces the regime's hand. It basically compels them to retaliate in a visible, significant way. They have to save face, maintain legitimacy at home, show strength to their regional network, their proxies, their allies. They become strategically obligated to respond. They almost have no choice but to hit back hard.
So, announcing the casualties isn't just like reporting bad news. It's actually a calculated move in this whole strategic game being played out.
Precisely.
And the source is clear. This isn't just a few isolated accidental hits, right? This is a pattern.
Definitely a pattern.
We saw those recent reports, and these sources were written when these were fresh, mentioning the killing of 2 additional senior staff officers within Iran's general staff. Brigadier General Mehdi Rabbani, head of operations, and Brigadier General Gholam Reza Merabi, responsible for intelligence. I mean, these are very specific, very high-level roles. This pattern really suggests a deliberate, systematic strategy, targeting command and control.
Absolutely. Based on the source material, it seems crystal clear Israel is deliberately focused on causing significant strategic losses right within the core military leadership structure. The goal isn't just random attrition. It appears designed specifically to maybe isolate the supreme leader by taking out key figures he relies on for military advice and command. And perhaps more broadly, to just inject distrust, instability within that command hierarchy. The source even makes an interesting note, speculating that maybe some of these leaders were meeting together underground when they got hit, drawing a comparison to bunker tactics used by groups like Hezbollah to protect their commanders.
That comparison is really telling. It suggests a certain level of adaptation and precision in the targeting.
It does.
And this brings us right to that foreign policy article featuring the Iranian writer Afshon Ostovar's analysis. He goes deeper into who these targeted leaders actually are and the impact their losses had. He talks about specific leaders being hit, and the article highlights 4 names whose deaths, he says, shook Iran deeply. Who are these 4?
Yeah, these are names that, according to Ostovar's analysis in the source, were just absolutely central pillars of Iran's military structure, and they enjoyed a very close, very trusted relationship with the supreme leader himself.
The inner circle.
Pretty much. They were widely seen as among the strongest, most capable figures within the whole command structure, covering both the regular army and the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Their influence really came from their closeness to the top leadership and their deep foundational military thinking. The 4 names specifically mentioned are Mohammad Bagheri, the Army Chief of Staff.
Okay.
Hossein Salami, the IRGC commander.
Big name.
Huge name. Ghulam Ali Rashid, the Deputy Ground Forces commander. And General Ali Hajizadeh, the Aerospace Force commander.
Okay, those are incredibly high-level positions. Army Chief, IRGC commander, Aerospace.
But why these four specifically? What made them so crucial, so indispensable, according to Ostovar's detailed analysis?
Well, as the source explains it, these guys weren't just high-ranking officials punching a clock. They were, in Ostovar's words, the figures the supreme leader relied on completely for guiding the military. They were seen as the bedrock of strength within the military leadership, partly because of that personal connection and trust from Khamenei,
Right.
but also because of their decades of experience and strategic know-how. They weren't just carrying out plans, they were integral to actually making them.
And here's where it gets really interesting and, frankly, quite surprising. Ostovar, the expert quoted in the source, makes the statement that just completely reframes the perceived importance of some key Iranian figures. He singled out General Ali Hajizadeh.
The aerospace guy. Yeah, the aerospace guy. He said Hajizadeh was potentially more important than Qasem Soleimani.
Wow.
Now think about that. Qasem Soleimani was internationally known, head of the Quds Force, architect of the whole regional proxy network, widely seen as one of the most powerful military figures in the entire Middle East.
Absolutely iconic figure in many ways.
Exactly. So to suggest Hajizadeh was more important, that's a massive statement. Why would Ostovar say that? What made Hajizadeh so uniquely crucial?
What's truly fascinating here, and it gets into the real specifics laid out in the source, is the nature of Hajizadeh's contributions. He wasn't just a commander leading troops or managing operations day to day. He was a foundational, technical, and strategic architect of Iran's modern military capabilities.
Okay, an architect. How so?
According to the source, he literally founded Iran's indigenous missile program, started it from scratch. He was absolutely instrumental in creating their sophisticated drone system, which, as we know, has become a major strategic asset for them.
Huge. Drones are everywhere now.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
But he didn't stop there. He actively established the relationships needed to export these weapons, particularly drones, to countries like Russia and Ethiopia. The source even specifically mentions a military agreement forged with Ethiopia under his influence, presumably tied to drone sales or tech transfer.
So wait, he didn't just build weapons for Iran, he turned Iran into a military exporter.
Exactly. He transformed Iran into a state capable of exporting significant military tech, especially these increasingly effective drones. And according to the source, the money, the revenue generated from these exports, it was plowed right back into further developing Iran's own domestic drone capabilities. It created this sort of self-sustaining cycle of development and proliferation.
Wow.
And his tenure speaks volumes, too. He was in the IRGC for 45 years.
45 years.
And held that crucial aerospace force commander job since 2009. That just shows how deeply entrenched, how experienced, and how influential he was within the system, specifically responsible for building Iran's most critical, modern, asymmetric capabilities, the very things that pose a direct threat to Israel and others in the region.
That really puts it into perspective. These aren't just random casualties. They're systematically taking out the core architects, the tech innovators, the strategic relationship builders of Iran's most significant modern military programs, missiles, drones. It's hitting the brain trust, not just the operational commanders.
Precisely. And this intense focus on eliminating leadership figures, as we've been talking about, it ties back to a strategic concept mentioned in the source. They draw a parallel to the long fight against Hezbollah. It's essentially a decapitation strategy.
Right, cut off the head.
Yeah, the fundamental idea is if you can successfully cut off the head, the central command, the key leadership, then the body, in this case the highly centralized Iranian military structure, will weaken. It could lose coherence, direction, effectiveness over time.
Okay, so if they're targeting the very top tier, what about the people stepping up to replace them? The source mentions the deputies are moving into these roles now. Are they just as capable as the leaders who were lost?
Well, according to the view presented in the source, while these deputies like Majid Musavi, who reportedly took over from Hajizadeh and was appointed directly by Khamenei, they're certainly chosen for their perceived leadership ability.
Sure.
They are generally not seen as having the same level of overall capability or strategic depth, or, and this is crucial, the same deep, hard-won experience as that older generation of leaders who were targeted.
Okay, so there's a drop-off.
The source suggests that. It notes the deputies are often close in age to the leaders that they're replacing, but they fundamentally lack that specific, critical combat history that the older generation got from navigating decades of conflict.
That implies the immediate impact of losing the top tier might not be obvious right away, like systems and plans are already running.
Exactly, you've hit the nail on the head. The source points out that the full effect of losing these foundational leaders won't necessarily be apparent right away in the immediate aftermath. Existing plans, strategies that the killed leaders put in place, they're likely still being executed, and the deputies are probably capable of overseeing those.
Right.
The real impact, what the source calls the delayed impact, will likely surface if and when the conflict escalates further, or if it becomes a protracted long-term war that requires significant adaptation, new strategic thinking.
That's when the experience gap shows up.
That's exactly when you need that kind of deep, practical experience the older generation gained from navigating complex stuff like the Iran-Iraq War, dealing with U.S. military operations over the years, the ISIS war. That's where the gap between the old guard and the new deputies might truly become apparent.
Okay, so there's this vulnerability building over time by hitting the top. But Ostovar, in the source, he warns about something even more dangerous, a most dangerous scenario. What exactly is that scenario he warns about?
Yeah, this is where the analysis takes a particularly grim turn. Ostovar's most dangerous scenario isn't just the killing of the very top-tier foundational leaders we've discussed. It's what happens if the deputies themselves, that second tier stepping into those roles, start getting killed in significant numbers.
Killing the replacements. Why is that the threshold for catastrophe, according to the source? What's fundamentally different or more risky about losing the second tier compared to the first?
The source explains the critical difference lies in the level below the deputies, the sub-deputies, the next rung down the command ladder.
Right.
These individuals, according to Ostovar's analysis, are typically much younger. They have significantly, maybe dramatically, less combat experience than even the deputies, let alone the original highly experienced leaders. There's this huge, almost generational experience gap at that level. But maybe even more critically, the source raises this profound question about obedience and discipline. Will these younger, less proven commanders who haven't earned their authority over decades in the same way, will they command the same absolute, unquestioning obedience, that cultural expectation of order, and it is obeyed, that figures like Hajizadeh or Soleimani commanded?
The chain of command might fray.
Exactly. Losing the deputies could force these less experienced, potentially less authoritative figures into positions of real power. And that, the source warns, could lead to internal instability within the military ranks, a questioning of leadership directives, and potentially unpredictable or undisciplined actions on the battlefield if orders aren't followed with the same rigor.
Okay, so circling back then to Stephen Cook's initial question about the unprecedented scale of the strikes and connecting it to this systematic, deep targeting of Iranian leadership, all the way down to potentially the deputies. What does the accumulation of all these points tell us about Israel's ultimate, overarching goal in this conflict, according to these analysts?
Well, based on Stephen Cook's argument, which really ties together that broad scope of targets hitting infrastructure, military bases, leaders, not just nuclear sites, the compelling conclusion he draws is that Israel's large-scale operation is fundamentally aimed at destroying the Iranian regime itself, not merely neutralizing or containing the nuclear program.
Destroying the regime, wow. That sounds like a massive, massive undertaking.
Huge.
Why would that be the primary goal? Is it somehow perceived as more achievable than hitting the nuclear program directly?
This is precisely where Ostovar's analysis, and an interesting quote from an Israeli commander mentioned in the source, provides a really crucial piece of the puzzle. According to Ostovar, and echoed by this Israeli commander, Israel is currently unable to destroy the nuclear program directly.
Unable. Why?
The source suggests that Israel might currently lack the specific military munitions, think certain types of deep-penetrating bunker busters that would be necessary to effectively reach and destroy Iran's really deeply buried nuclear facilities, like Fordo.
Okay. So if directly destroying the cause of the existential threat, the nuclear program isn't currently feasible with the tools they have.
Exactly. The conclusion drawn from the source is that since destroying the nuclear program itself is seen, right now, as an unachievable objective for Israel, changing the regime that controls the nuclear program might be perceived as an easier, or at least a viable, alternative primary objective.
A different path to the same ultimate security goal, maybe?
Perhaps. This inability to hit the nuclear sites directly, combined with the intense desire to eliminate that threat, could be the strategic calculus driving the broad and lethal nature of these recent strikes, targeting the infrastructure, leadership, capabilities that sustain the regime itself, rather than just narrowly focusing only on the hardened nuclear infrastructure they maybe can't reach effectively.
And Cook's perspective on the current Israeli government guiding this strategy. He uses pretty strong language, doesn't he? Calling them extremist.
He does. He characterizes the behavior of the current Israeli government as extremist. And he points to several actions to back this up. He cites the extended war in Gaza, arguing it seems driven by broader political and religious aims, not just strictly military objectives.
Okay.
He also mentions their aggressive actions in Syria and Lebanon, and now this large-scale operation against Iran, which he describes as reckless, specifically noting that it involves civilian casualties and the targeting of civilian buildings. He sees these actions, taken together, as part of a consistent pattern of behavior from what he views as an extremist government.
The source even brings up Netanyahu's famous quote about wanting to create a new Middle East in this context, implying that maybe this is the vision underlying these actions, whether it's rooted in religious extremism or just a raw drive for overwhelming military dominance.
That's right. Cook's analysis seems to be asking that very question. Is this vision of a new Middle East being pursued through a religiously motivated extremist lens, or is it simply about establishing absolute military dominance over rivals? Either way, the actions described in the source from Gaza to Iran strongly suggest, in Cook's view, that an extremist government is indeed behind this strategic shift towards such a broad and potentially destabilizing goal like regime change.
What Cook found particularly surprising, according to the source, is the U.S. role in all this, or maybe the lack of a visible role in stopping it.
Yeah, he questions that.
He expresses surprise that the U.S., Israel's closest ally, apparently allowed or perhaps even tacitly supported Israel undertaking such a dangerous and, as Cook puts it, a killer operation aimed at regime change.
Which is a massive goal.
Targeting regime change is an absolutely massive undertaking. It's not something you achieve in days or weeks, even with the best tech. It implies a potentially very long, drawn-out, and incredibly risky conflict.
It definitely raises significant questions about the level of U.S. involvement or understanding, or maybe tolerance, regarding the true scope and aims of Israel's operations against Iran right now.
Okay, shifting gears slightly here. The source material also highlights a really critical vulnerability within Iran's own defenses that these strikes seem to be exploiting. What's Iran's key weakness identified in these analyses?
The major, maybe even existential vulnerability identified in the source material is Iran's air defenses.
Air defenses. What's the issue there? Are they just outdated or insufficient?
The source is pretty blunt about it. It explicitly states that Iran lacks adequate air defenses. It uses the stark phrase that Iran's sky is exposed.
Wow. Exposed.
Yeah. The analysis suggests that Israeli aircraft can reportedly operate with significant freedom over Iranian airspace, pretty much unimpeded. This is described as a major gap, a critical loophole in Iran's military capabilities when facing a sophisticated air force like Israel's. They simply cannot effectively defend their own airspace against these high-end threats.
And what's the consequence of having such porous air defenses when you're facing these kinds of widespread deep strikes? What price is Iran paying for this vulnerability?
The consequence, according to the source, is just immense. This vulnerability means Iran is paying a very, very high price for this conflict. The damage sustained is significant. The source goes so far as to call the situation a catastrophe for Iran.
A catastrophe.
Yeah. It even speculates that this fundamental vulnerability could potentially be the beginning of the end of the war, not necessarily meaning immediate surrender, but suggesting that the cost, in terms of damage, casualties, the sheer inability to protect itself from the air, it's just unsustainable in the long run without dramatic improvements to their air defense capabilities, which aren't easy to just acquire overnight.
Right.
The Iranian regime's ability, and maybe the population's willingness, to tolerate this ongoing unmitigated damage, that's going to be severely tested.
So while Israel might face technical limits hitting those deep nuclear sites, Iran has this fundamental crippling exposure from the air that is costing it dearly. Now, the source also mentions potential Iranian miscalculations. One particularly dangerous statement attributed to Iran is the suggestion they might launch, 2,000 or maybe 1,000 missiles next in retaliation.
Yeah, a huge escalation.
That would be a significant escalation in scale compared to their initial barrage.
Right. But what's crucial here when you consider that statement is to look at the nature and effectiveness of Iran's previous initial strike against Israel, as the source describes it.
Okay.
It's noted that that strike, while large in terms of the number of drones and missiles, was relatively limited in its targets. It did not target the most sensitive or critical sites in Israel, things like the Dimona nuclear reactor, major power grids, key ports, critical military bases that would truly cripple the country's ability to function or retaliate.
So they held back on the really critical stuff.
It seems so. Even targets that were hit, like the IDF headquarters, were apparently not deemed sensitive or crucial enough by the U.S. to provoke an overwhelming military intervention from Washington.
Right, the U.S. didn't feel compelled to jump in full force based on those strikes.
Exactly. The source implies the targets chosen, the overall impact of Iran's first big strike, were not severe enough to incapacitate Israel in a way it couldn't recover from, or to trigger the most extreme possible U.S. military response.
Okay.
And this links back to the New York Times view, also mentioned in the source, which states that despite all the strikes and counterstrikes, the core strategic asset Israel is most worried about, the Iranian nuclear program, remains intact.
Still there.
Still there. This suggests Israel might be calculating, maybe gambling, that Iran's underlying vulnerabilities, those poor air defenses, perhaps internal weaknesses made worse by the targeted killings, could lead the Iranian regime to make critical, potentially self-destructive mistakes or miscalculations.
And that dangerous possibility you mentioned earlier, the idea that a cornered regime might actually become more reckless.
Yes. The source specifically warns about that. If the Iranian regime feels increasingly weak, vulnerable, maybe even on the verge of collapse due to these sustained pressures and losses, it could become more reckless and unpredictable.
Like what?
Well, this could potentially lead to dangerous statements or actions, perhaps threatening or even attempting strikes against U.S. military bases in the Gulf at some stage, adopting a desperate attitude of hit everyone if they feel they have nothing left to lose. That's a terrifying escalation possibility that the source flags.
Absolutely terrifying. Now, one of the most perplexing points raised in the source material, especially given this systematic targeting and killing of such high-ranking Iranian commanders, it's the puzzle of Iran's proxies.
Ah, yes, the proxies.
Why haven't Iran's regional arms, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, why haven't they been fully unleashed in a massive, coordinated, all-out attack on Israel from day one?
It is a major question the sources grapple with because, as the analysis points out, given that Israel has targeted and killed figures as significant as, referencing past actions, Soleimani.
Right. The current IRGC commander, the Aerospace Force commander, seemingly the top tier of the Army staff. Conventional military thinking would absolutely suggest that Iran's well-armed, well-trained proxies should have retaliated with everything they have against Israel from the moment these high-level killings began.
That's supposed to be their whole purpose.
Right.
Deterrence and retaliation.
Exactly. Their entire purpose, from Iran's perspective, is supposed to be that deterrent force and a means of asymmetric retaliation.
So the fact that Hezbollah, which has this massive arsenal right on Israel's border, hasn't launched, tens or hundreds of thousands of rockets, that's unexpected.
It is unexpected, given the scale of attacks on Iran itself. Their response, while significant with daily exchanges, hasn't been that full-scale, overwhelming barrage many anticipated if Iran itself was being hit this hard.
So why not? What are the possible explanations? Well, the source offers a couple of potential, maybe interconnected explanations for this apparent restraint, this lack of full engagement. One possibility is that these proxies, despite all the rhetoric, are actually weaker or maybe less willing to engage in a truly existential fight on Iran's behalf than they're often perceived to be.
They have their own interests, their own calculations.
Exactly. They might have their own local calculations and limitations. Or, alternatively, it might mean that Israel successfully gambled on their relative weakness, or maybe their strategic unwillingness to fully engage in this specific phase of the conflict for their own reasons.
And what's the consequence for the overall conflict if these powerful proxies do remain largely subdued or only engage in limited ways?
Well, if the proxies largely stay on the sidelines or limit their actions to the level we've seen so far, it fundamentally changes the risk calculus. It effectively grants Israel, and by extension the U.S., greater freedom of action, more tolerance for risk in their ongoing operations against Iran proper.
Because they don't have to fight a massive war on multiple fronts simultaneously?
Precisely. Without that constant, overwhelming threat from Hezbollah or the Houthis, forcing Israel to divert massive resources and focus, the path is clearer, albeit still incredibly dangerous for Israel to pursue its objectives against Iran directly.
So, okay, looking at all these intricate pieces together, the unexpectedly broad and deep strikes hitting infrastructure, leadership, the potential huge goal of regime change may be driven by not being able to hit the nuke sites directly, Iran's fundamental costly weakness in air defense, the risks of Iranian miscalculation from weakness or desperation, and this puzzle of the seemingly subdued proxies. What's the final overall picture these diverse sources paint for us about the nature of this conflict right now? Where does this leave us?
The final perspective offered across the source material as well. It's quite stark and sobering. It suggests pretty strongly that this is not a conflict with a visible near-term endpoint.
No quick fix.
No quick fix. It doesn't look like a short, contained military operation designed to achieve some specific limited objective quickly and then wrap up. Instead, the combined analysis suggests this appears to be a prolonged military campaign.
A campaign, not just an operation.
Exactly. A much longer term, perhaps multi-year effort that will require significant time to fully play out and potentially achieve its objectives, whatever those ultimately prove to be for both the Israeli and the Iranian sides. There's just no quick resolution on the horizon, according to these analyses.
That really does paint a picture far more intricate, concerning, and potentially long-lasting than the simple daily headlines might suggest. We've seen how these sources collectively indicate a conflict that's targeting the very core of Iran's command structure, potentially aiming for a seismic shift like regime change, driven by strategic limitations on one side, potentially extremist motivations, all set against Iran's fundamental vulnerabilities and the unpredictable reactions that weakness could potentially provoke.
It is indeed a complex and deeply concerning web of dynamics we're looking at.
Absolutely. And on that note, the source suggests that perhaps the most dangerous point in this entire prolonged military campaign might not even have arrived yet.
Right.
They warn that the systematic killing of the second tier of Iranian commanders, those deputies stepping into the critical roles, could be the moment that leads to a loss of discipline. Potentially unpredictable, highly risky actions by inexperienced younger leaders who just lack the authority and strategic depth of their predecessors. Given that analysis, what does that imply about the risks inherent in the next phases of this long-term military campaign as it potentially grinds on?
That's a profound question, isn't it? And it really underscores the unpredictable nature of whatever lies ahead.
Indeed. So to everyone listening, stay curious, keep asking questions, and definitely continue diving deeper into these complex topics. They truly require a deep dive to even begin to understand. Until next time, keep exploring.
And please make sure to subscribe to the Deep Research Podcast.